Welcome to Mental Makeover Radio, your go-to destination for meaningful conversations about mental health. I'm your host and your trusted therapist bestie, Cecilia Manella. Join us as we explore the complexities and messiness of human experience by addressing your questions and concerns. I'm here to provide a straightforward and practical therapy advice. So grab your favorite beverage, whether it's tea, coffee, or whatever tickles your taste buds, and get ready to embark on a mental makeover. It has been quite a week. I know that everyone in your life is probably talking about the election or something to do with the American election. And I really just want to talk about conflict. So if you're tuning in for the first time, I'm Cecilia Manella. I'm your host of Mental Makeover Radio. And if you've been here listening for a bit, then welcome back. I want to talk today about divisiveness and conflict resolution. I think that when there's so much happening on the world stage and we're participating in what's happening, I think we kind of lose track a little bit of ourselves, of our relationships, and we kind of get caught up in the energy of what's happening. Now, that's really normal. We're just human, right? Like, I know I say that a lot, but it's a good reminder that in this great thing that we call life, we are just human. We are just animals that happen to walk upright and talk and be able to reflect and have thoughts in that way. But really, we are just human. And the human experience is messy and it's complex and convoluted. And we really, really love to hope that there's some simplicity in it. But I think the truth is that most things are not simple. And in fact, they're quite complex. So I know that what I've been hearing in my office this past week and with people in my life, but also just kind of what's happening on social media, just watching what the trends are and what's happening with posts and what people are saying. I wanted to talk about conflict. And when we feel divisive in the sense that we're on polar opposite ends of something, whether it's religion or political ideology or belief systems or values, that's a bit of divisiveness, we get really riled up about it. And we don't often engage in any kind of conflict resolution anymore. And I think that part of that influence this is my bias, is that it's really advent of social media. And not that I'm saying social media is bad, because I'm not saying that. It's just a tool, right? So there's lots of things in our life that are tools. And social media is a tool. And we can kind of get caught up in it a little bit. And this tool allows us to engage globally, which is amazing. It's connected, it's like how the internet changed our lives in the 90s, is all of a sudden our world became the world. It wasn't just our community or small spaces anymore, or just the towns we could travel to, but our world became universal, became everywhere, where we could have conversations, from Canada all the way to China and have friends internationally, just radically change our lives. And social media has done the same thing in that we are now able to follow and comment and participate in conversations with people all around the world. And what's come with that also is, this idea of truth is a little bit slippery when we're talking about, fake accounts or people posting anonymously, or you don't even know who the person is. I mean, it's just an account that you see a face, or maybe there's a profile photo. Sometimes there isn't. And we just engage without really thinking, is this actually really a real person? And is this person who they represent themselves to be? Because as humans, we just don't stop to think about that. We've not evolved to even consider that what we see isn't true. And this is why we get so hooked and so quickly hooked into things. And part of this culture of social media is ability to say awful, atrocious things to another human being without having to do it face to face. So what happens is we don't see the repercussions of our words. And so therefore we can get meaner and we get much more cruel, and the things that are being said can be absolutely awful. And it can create a lot of divisiveness, and it can create a lot of anger. Now, anger has a role in many ways, because really what's below that anger is most likely fear. I think most of us are just scared. Divisiveness creates a lot of fear. When we can't have conversation, that creates a lot of fear. When people are saying awful things or hateful things, that creates a lot of fear. So, and in that fear, we do things to motivate us, to move us through it. And anger is kind of the emotion that really gives us a lot of oomph, let's say. It gives us a lot of energy and its ability to just really move us. We really don't love to be standing still. And your reaction to fear is going to be based on your own experiences, right? So it's going to be based on your own childhood. It's going to be how you're raised and family dynamics, potentially childhood trauma. There's a lot of things that come from fear, and how we deal with fear shows up. Now, we will most likely either run away or we will get really big, or, we kind of freeze. So if you want to dive into a little bit more about anger, you can tune into episode 29, where I really worked on unpacking anger a little bit. But when it comes to conflict, fear shows up. So I have some ideas around how you can begin to navigate some conversations that maybe have had a lot of conflict, or there's going to be conflict, or those as differences. Now, it doesn't really matter whether this is about politics or about belief systems, or whether someone took out the garbage or not. Like this approach to conflict resolution is actually applicable to all situations in any type of relationship. And how you navigate this maybe depends on the type of relationship it is, whether it's a coworker or a family member or a partner or your child. It can be very different in the way that it shows up, but really the steps are very, very similar. So I want you to think about the relationship that you probably have some of the most conflict in, as I kind of navigate some of these ideas and some steps for you to take, and be curious about how you can engage in that conversation in a different way. And because we can't change somebody else. As much as I would love to be able to tell you that you can, find a magic wand and change the other person and your life is going to be rainbows and butterflies, that would be amazing. But that's actually not what happens. We can't change anyone else. The only person we can change is yourself. That's the only person you're in charge of. And that's the only person you have power to do something with. So this is about tuning into your process. Now, most of us are very conflict avoidant. Now, if you're a woman, you're even more conflict avoidant. That's socially kind of driven into us. It's how we've been brought up, but also whether you're conflict avoidant or not, it really comes down to family dynamics. It comes down to how you grew up and whether you witnessed your parents or the adults in your life navigate conflict in a healthy, connected way, or was conflict something that was really scary for you as a child. For most people, they either never saw it, so it was done behind closed doors, or it was actually really scary. So we didn't really learn how to do conflict as we became adults, and we just repeated the patterns in which we grew up in. So this is going to really push you out of your comfort zone just a little bit around not being able to avoid this. So the first thing to do in the step number 1 is entering any conversation is listening to understand. We so often listen to respond, but we actually don't listen to understand. And a really good way into this conversation with someone is to actually say, help me understand blank, whatever the conflict is. Help me understand your values. Help me understand your position. Help me understand your decision. Help me understand, why you think this way, or how come you feel this way. So instead of coming in with, why do you feel this way? Why do you think this way? The word why is actually quite confrontational. And it elicits defensiveness. Whereas if you come in with the phrase, help me understand, and also with a tone that is warm and welcoming and kind, and just really out of curiosity, not in a condescending kind of way, because I know all of us, including myself, sometimes our tone can be very different than the words we're using. So communication is a lot to do with tone, not necessarily the words we're using. I want you to think about entering conversations with someone you have conflict with, but in place of trying to understand them. in seeking to understand, it doesn't mean that we actually are agreeing with them or that we're supporting them in their position or their thought process or whatever it is that the conflict is about. It is really about trying to understand the other person as a human being. And what that requires from us is to not be listening to respond. So we're not going in with a yeah, buts or interrupting. We're actually just listening. And we're listening with the goal of understanding this other person. You don't have to agree with it, but you have to move towards trying to understand them. Trust me, when you enter conflict in this way, when you're looking for understanding and not listening to respond, you experience that conversation very differently. And what that does is it relieves you from the pressure of having to have an answer or having to have a response to something. And you're just there to listen, to try to understand this person. And you can ask questions that come from the place of curiosity. It is a great place to start a conversation. So if we're talking about elevation, like if we were to put elevation on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the most elevated and heated conversation, 1 being the lowest, you kind of get to enter the conversation at a 0. And so if the other person's actually really elevated, let's say they're at a 5 and you come in at a 0, and all you're looking is to understand, you can cue them and ask them to kind of bring that, that intensity down a little bit so you can have a conversation that's based on understanding. Now, don't be fooled into thinking that they are going to want to understand your position, because that may not actually happen. And that often escalates conflict because we're not, again, focused on changing another person. We're just looking at changing ourselves and changing how we interact into conflict. So going into that conversation with an open heart, with some kindness, even if you already know you don't agree with them, still show up with some kindness in seeking to understand. The second thing to do is to be really clear on your position. So if the other person doesn't respond with, I want to understand your position, which is in the ideal world, the person would reciprocate the question and you'd both be having a conversation about understanding. If that doesn't happen, it's still important for you to know where you stand, what your values are, what your position is, your belief systems are, because that just helps you stay rooted in your position. Now, that's not to be as in rooted as in not being willing to change or negotiate or compromise, but just being really aware of where you are at with things. So if there's conflict in a relationship and all you feel are a lot of emotions and you haven't taken the time to titrate those down into a thought process or something that you can speak to in a calm manner, then I really encourage you to journal this out, because elevated emotions are a sign that something is happening. So it's important to pay attention to that. And it's also important to understand, well, what's feeding this emotion? What are the thoughts? What are the beliefs? What's happening? What's happening? Is this fear? What am I scared of? And this really empowers you in those conversations when you have clarity of your position, because it's not about the other person convincing you of something different. And it's not about you convincing them of something different. It's just having clarity around you are. There's no need to try to convince somebody else if they're not open to listening to understand you, but you can be open to understanding them, because they will show you their values, their beliefs, their position. They will show you what matters to them. And when you're clear on your own position, it means you don't get wrapped up in trying to convince someone to think differently or feel differently or do anything differently. You're just there to really just understand them. What that leads to is the third piece of this, which is being clear about what the conflict actually is about. The conflict is not about who's emptying out the dishwasher. The conflict is not about taking out the garbage. The conflict isn't about someone being late. That's not really what the conflict's about. The conflict is significantly deeper. The roots are significantly deeper. We're just more comfortable fighting, arguing, having conflict about things that feel very superficial. And we don't often pull those roots out to figure out what's really going on. And most of the time, now not all the time, but most of the time, like 99% of the time, conflicts between people, between humans, is about values. We're just talking about different value sets. We're just valuing something different. Or our interpretation of that value is actually really different. Now, if you really want to learn about your own values, or just kind of like learning about someone else's values, to be honest, I've got a workbook for you. Super easy, probably shouldn't call it a workbook. It's more of just a downloadable exercise, so to speak, a values exercise that you can get at ceciliamanella.com/values. I'll leave a link of it in the show notes for you as well. And it's a really great exercise to do to really find out what your values are. But in that, you can also find out what someone else's values are. And 99% of conflict is about differences in values or differences in how we interpret that value. So different values can mean safety versus autonomy, or it can be respect versus independence. So these values can create a friction when they rub up against each other in any kind of relationship. And in this friction is where the conflict lies. And so we get caught in the sparks of that friction, but we're not really paying attention to what's actually causing the friction to begin with. So that's one version. The other version of having different interpretations of values is like, let's say, the value of safety. Well, how that's interpreted is very different to each person, or the value of family. If I have the value of family and my partner has the value of family, and we don't spend some time asking each other what that actually means, then we can come into conflict assuming that the other person has the same definition or the same way they live into that value, when in fact we're doing it very differently. And so for me, maybe it's spending a lot of time with family, and maybe for my partner, it's having an open door policy to our home. And in that, we can get into a lot of conflict about it if we're not actually talking about the value itself and then how we define that value. How does it show up in our lives? So if you download the values exercise, it comes with instructions on that too, and journaling prompts around digging into what do these values actually mean to you and how do they actually show up in your life. All conflict comes down to values. It's a different value set. And when you understand the value that's in conflict, it becomes easier to be in relationship with this person, because let's face it, we cannot cut off everybody in our life who has a different opinion as us. We just can't. We have to live in relationships knowing that there's a little bit of difference, and that we can't always surround ourselves with people who have the same ideas, who have the same belief as us. It can get really lonely. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't reasons to end relationships. There are reasons to end relationships, but that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about conflict that happens all the time. And so I want you to think about the value differences that are in conflict with each other and why they're rubbing up on each other in this way. The fourth thing to do is to really find out what you have in common. I mean, you have a relationship with this person to begin with, whether it's been a short-term relationship or a new friendship or a long-term relationship, whatever it is, you have a relationship with this person. You clearly have things in common. You can't have everything that's not in common. So it's important to not lose track of the commonalities or the things that keep you tied to each other, because it's important to have a bit of a balance here in conflict, is to remember that we're listening to understand because we know this person and there's something in there that we have some sort of commonality with. The thing is that if you ask yourself what I have in common with this person and your answer is nothing, then maybe the relationship has evolved in a way that you haven't been paying attention to. Or maybe you haven't been paying attention to, you just haven't really made a decision. But that going through this makes you realize that you just don't have that much in common anymore. And in this growing apart that's probably happened over time, the conflict has increased and the commonalities have decreased over time. And maybe you knew, but maybe some of this that's happened recently is really highlighting that. And maybe it's time to start asking yourself some questions about this relationship and what you want out of it. And does it have the ability to be a longevity relationship, or has it kind of reached its peak at this point? And the last thing to keep in mind is really how to be kind while maintaining your integrity. And this is a really difficult one because I think that when we're fearful and anger shows up and we're defensive or we're feeling really protective and we're in conflict, that kindness kind of goes out the window. And now that's a normal response, but I'm challenging you to rise a little bit higher than that. Because when we lean into anger in this way or get really cruel and mean with our words, we lose ourselves. We've lost our integrity. And what I see happening online and what I see happening in relationships is that we've kind of lost track of that. We've lost track of the importance of our own integrity, or we've just missed it. And what happens is that when we don't react with kindness to maintain our own integrity, we lose a piece of ourselves. And in this whole divisiveness that's happening, what makes me the saddest is how much we're losing ourselves. We can have differences of opinion. We can have different political ideologies. We can have different values. We can have different belief systems. And yet we can still be kind. And we don't have to lose ourselves in it. And I really would love to get back to that, to being able to have conflict with kindness and to love ourselves through it. Because when we lose our connection to our integrity and kindness, we are really betraying ourselves. And that is the greatest cost that any of us pay. And there's lines at some point that we can't get back from. There are lines that get crossed and relationships end when they probably didn't need to. And I think that if we could just remember to act in kindness to maintain our integrity in the face of challenging conversations and challenging relationships. Doesn't mean you need to be close to people. But I don't want you to lose yourself in all of this either. I don't want you to lose track of who you are, your values, what you have to share with the world. I don't want you to lose track of yourself. I don't want you to lose you. I want you to embrace yourself and find yourself in all of this and do hard conversations just a little bit differently, where you can walk away feeling good about how you dealt with it. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't mean you're going to have to agree. It doesn't mean the relationship may not end, but it means that you can be proud of how you handled yourself in it. And that is worth so much more than being right, or it's worth so much more than trying to convince somebody that they're wrong or that you're right. Because at the end of the day, when we look in the mirror, we're all just looking at ourselves. And can you be proud of the person that you are? Can you celebrate the person that you are? Can you be really engaged with showing up with kindness for yourself and for others? Because that's where integrity lies. Because ongoing divisiveness is not going to get us there. It's just going to make things so much more worse. And in conflict, we can grow relationships. We can be closer to people by knowing more about them and knowing what makes them tick and understanding them. And in that process, not losing ourselves, but in fact, finding ourselves, remembering that we can face fear and anger with some kindness, and it makes all the difference in the world. I hope you found this episode helpful. And if you know someone in your life that maybe would appreciate listening to this, or maybe needs to listen to it, maybe they won't appreciate it, but maybe they need to listen to it, I would love it for you to share this episode with them. Thank you for being part of the Mental Makeover community and tuning in every single week. I really appreciate you. And I will see you next week. Be bold, be brave, be well.